Well, hello there, and thank you for joining me on this, the inaugural series of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As well, this is also the podcast's 11th episode, so this is kind of neat little milestone for me. We are officially in double digits, which is exciting. Which also, we're not going to count the 10th episode, because, I don't know, I forgot to do that for that one. But, hey, we're double digits, which I think is kind of neat. But anyways, I'm your host, Kyle, and today we are talking about a man that you might have heard of. Today, we are talking about the life and times of Grigori Rasputin. Rasputin, both then and now, is most well known for his legendary exploits as a close friend, confidant, and advisor to the Tsar Nikolai II and Tsarina Alexandra, just before the total, irrevocable collapse of the Russian Empire. Most discussions of Rasputin focus on any number of 1 to 3 topics. 1, his debaucherous nature. 2, the influence that he had over the royal family. And 3, his rather dramatic and untimely demise as a result of the first 2 points. While all 3 of these points are important, and we are going to discuss them, my intention is to give a more fuller look at the life of Rasputin. We are going to discuss not just Rasputin's life in the imperial court, but also how he got there, and what the kind of legacy they left behind was. So, with no further ado, let's talk Rasputin. On January 22nd of 1869, Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born to a peasant family in the town of Pokrovskaya in Siberia. Just a little quick aside on the town of Pokrovskaya. It's still there, still exists. It's in the Tyumen Oblast, and it's a village that is so small, and in fact, its Wikipedia page only has a picture of it from 1912. And when I looked it up originally, all I got was a city by the same name in Ukraine. And at first, I couldn't actually find anything out about the city. And I say that as if I found out a lot more, which I didn't. I can't even really tell you how many people live there. The best I could do is on that same Wikipedia page, which is all of about 3 paragraphs long, it said that there's about 1,200 people that live there. So, yeah, we don't really know a whole lot about the place. It really seems that the only reason anyone even knows it exists is because that's where Rasputin comes from. So, it is kind of nice to know that Pokrovskaya is probably basically exactly the same as it was in 1869 when Rasputin was born. But anyways, other than that, we don't really know a lot about his childhood. Believe it or not, but random towns out in the middle of bumfuck nowhere Siberia weren't exactly amazing at keeping records in, the late 1800s. But not to worry. Over the decades, a number of people have been so kind as to just kind of make up random bullshit nonsense about the childhood of Rasputin. Most of these stories focus on how Rasputin was a monstrous child, and that his parents, particularly his father, was a legendary sex pest. But we don't really know, and I don't know, that all kind of seems a little made up, especially because one of the things that's kind of interesting is a lot of people will say that Rasputin isn't actually his last name. That actually it is a Russian nickname because he's debaucherous, and it basically means like the debauched. And that's not true. That was his last name. That was his given name. That was his parents' names. It'll be his kid's last name. It'll be the name that actually a lot of other people outside of his own family even had. And I imagine that people still have to this day. So, just kind of, yeah, if you hear stories about like, oh no, even as a child he was some kind of weird, evil, debauched person, no, not really. Not from anything that I can tell. But what we do actually know is that he seemingly was a bit of a rowdy youth, and that there is some evidence that he may have been a bit of a drinker and maybe even a petty thief. Though this is quite a bit less exciting than any of the other stories that people made up about him, and all in all, he seemed like he was pretty normal. Like, sure, maybe he was a petty thief, but clearly, he's not being like locked up in prison and left to rot. And the whole alcohol thing, well, that is pretty normal, all things considered. Remember, this is 1, Russia, and 2, the 1800s. The level of drinking that can be expected even from, say, a teetotaler at the time is likely enough to kill a man today. So, all in all, Rasputin's not really showing any signs of him being, some legendary evil that would befall the world. Certainly nothing that really kind of portends for the future. Other than that, we really don't have a lot about him before his marriage at the age of 18, which, yeah, if you didn't know it, Rasputin was married, and he had kids. And these are folks who are not exactly like one-and-done characters. They're going to pop back up quite a bit. In fact, one of Rasputin's daughters is a major source on the man. And there's a lot to be said about, she writes, I think she writes after his death, but certainly at least after his rise to kind of prominence. And there's a lot to be said about, okay, well, how maybe truthful is she being? Is she just trying to cash in on the star of her father? Is she writing things that she has definitive proof for? We really don't know. But I think it is kind of very important to hear what she has to say about him, because she knew him better than certainly any of us, and she knew him better than a lot of other people, and she certainly wasn't out to, say, like, destroy him politically or anything. Though, granted, she could have been out to maybe save a little bit of his political figure. But, as we will see, because I have quite a few things from his daughter in this script and in the following episode, she's going to be a bit of a recurring character, is that she seems to be pretty evenly balanced on her opinions of Rasputin. But I digress. In 1887, Rasputin marries a woman named Praskovia Dubravina, now Praskovia Rasputina. Together, they had 7 children, only 3 of whom would survive till adulthood, because it's 1887 and we still haven't figured out medicine yet. Their names were Dmitri, Varvara, and Matriona, or Maria. Maria is the one who would end up writing quite a bit about her father. We also know that he and his family, his wife and kids, lived with his parents in Pokrovskaya, which is pretty normal, especially considering that it's Siberia. To this day, Russian family units are pretty close, and oftentimes a lot of them will live together even after marriage, especially in rural areas, especially in Siberia, which is then and now quite a bit poorer than a lot of the other parts of Russia. And then also there is the very real issue of, we can be warm here. So, by all means, this is pretty normal peasant stuff for a Siberian dude in 1887. After his marriage, he went back to, well, doing just that, being a normal Siberian peasant dude. He worked the fields, he raised his kids, he went to church on Sunday, and he'd get shit-faced over the weekends. He was a pretty normal guy, all things considered, and there's really no evidence to the contrary to say that he wasn't. But then kind of all of a sudden, really out of nowhere, things started to change, and Rasputin started to totally reshape his life. This all begins in the year 1897, when he was 28 years old, which for a Siberian peasant is a pretty good age for 1897. This man is solidly middle-aged, which is a little bit interesting that a lot of people will kind of point this out, that he is 28, almost 30 years old, and this is really where he starts to become a figure, which is pretty old, considering that he has a long way to go from just, some dude in a Siberian village. But anyways, so he's a middle-aged man, and like a lot of middle-aged men who all of a sudden feel like they're a lot more important than they are, he gets really into Jesus. This is when Rasputin starts to become the man we know him as today. In 1897, Rasputin began going on pilgrimages all over Russia. And why exactly? Well, no one really knows. We don't really have a good idea of why he started doing this. It kind of seems that one day he just got the bug to see the world, and so he just fucking did that. Which, I mean, yeah, fair enough. There are, of course, a number of mythologized reasons as to why Rasputin left Pokrovskaya. As with his kind of infancy and childhood, well, a lot of people just took it upon themselves to make random shit up. And, as you might expect, they all circle around him being a generally shitty person and trying to escape the consequences of his actions. One such story that was concocted by the Soviet government, decades after it supposedly happened, was that he fled in order to escape hard work. I find this one particularly unlikely, because he seems to have been doing that just fine for the past 28 years. So, why now? And it's not like from this point on, Rasputin just lives the high life and never works again. No, he comes back to Pokrovskaya multiple times throughout his life. And when he does come back, he helps in the fields and, he actually is working and stuff. So it does seem a little bit unlikely that for some reason in 1897 he just decides he's done with like the mere concept of working. Another story that was popular, particularly in the Russian court, was that he fled the area because he stole a horse. This also seems unlikely, as the local police don't seem to have any records of that, when they do have records of other things, like his original thieving, which is not horse-based. And really, kind of all in all, the records they have mostly just show him as being kind of a rowdy, drunk guy. Not really like some, massacre criminal. As well, like I said before, Rasputin's going to come back to Pokrovskaya, like, a number of times. And it seems maybe a little bit odd that, he never, goes to jail. If he's some big wanted horse thief that he had to flee all of Siberia to get away from the potential consequences, I feel like they would, lock him up when he came back. So, gonna have to put the old big inno onto that one. But not every reason given for Rasputin's departure was one that centered on him being some kind of malefactor or lazy jackass. Rasputin's daughter, and also a friend of Rasputin, a man named Dmitry Stripachev, told similar stories, in which one day Rasputin kind of just changed. Before, he was a drunkard and a rowdy dude, but all in all, not like a bad person, just, a bit of a shithead. And then one day, he starts getting visions from God. And now, all of a sudden, he's really into God and Jesus and the Bible and whatnot. Supposedly, he received a vision from the Mother Mary calling on him to travel the world and cleanse people of their sins. And as well, this story has a little bit of extra to it, as there were some in Pokrovskaya who told basically the same story so far, but they add maybe a little bit of context. And they told that Rasputin went on a trip to Tyumen, and on that trip he met a man named Melity Zaborovsky. Rasputin informed Zaborovsky of his visions and of God telling him to travel the world and cleanse the people of their sins. Zaborovsky, for his part, was a theology student, and he told Rasputin that, if God's talking to you, it's time to get going, buddy. You better do that, because you don't want to piss off the big man upstairs. So, in that story, Rasputin packs up his stuff and says, all right, man, time to go spread the good word. But really, we don't have a good understanding of why. So, for whatever the reason he had, it was enough for him to do it. And with that, he took the Spirit of God and likely a few spirits made of wheat or corn, and nothing else, and fucked off into the Russian wilderness. Rasputin went on these little pilgrimages pretty much alone. He would eventually make more friends and end up going on pilgrimages and voyages with them, and there were times where his wife and kids would come along on trips as well, but it kind of seems like he did this shit kind of all on his lonesome, particularly at the beginning, which I can only imagine that everyone in Pokrovskaya thought was just totally 100% above board and not that anything weird was happening. But to be fair, I am kind of just assuming that maybe people found it weird because, I don't know, I found it a little weird that, he's a 28-year-old middle-aged man and he just decides, you know what, I gotta abandon my family for months at a time and go to fun and exciting places without them. If you told me that my middle-aged neighbor just suddenly found God and said, hey, I need to get the hell out of Dodge for a little while, I would also think that, maybe that's a little bit weird. I mean, I'm not saying that he's doing anything necessarily evil or bad, but it just kind of screams midlife crisis, which is a little bit of a weird thing to think about for a dude in the 1800s, but I'm certain that there are plenty of people who had a similar kind of idea of, hey man, I'm stuck, my life isn't going anywhere, and I just need to do something exciting. So to me, the only way this could be more midlife crisis-y is if one day Rasputin showed back up from his pilgrimages with a brand new red Corvette. But 130-year-old gossip aside, he really did go to holy places, and he really did meet with holy people. There's a lot of questioning about Rasputin's religion and his convictions, but at this point, it really seems like he was actually doing and actually into what he said he was. He really did go to a lot of pilgrimage locations, and we know this because he seemingly always went out of his way to meet important people at these locations. And not only did he meet these people, he often made a really good impression on them, enough so that they wrote about him in their diaries, and some of these people would end up becoming close friends and very important and powerful friends of Rasputin down the line. One such person was a man named Makary, who was a starets. A starets is a kind of wandering monk or wise man in the Orthodox tradition. The starets is a part of a centuries-old tradition of self-separation as a form of asceticism, so that people could cast off their connections to the material world and focus more solely on the spiritual. These people were generally considered to be very powerful wise men, and much like any saint or spiritual figure, it was believed that they had the power to enact miracles. They were believed to be so wise and important that everyone from peasants to the czars were supposed to listen to the wisdom of the tsartsi. Rasputin met Makary in the town of Verkhuturi. Oh my god, I speak Russian and sometimes these get me. Verkhuturi, I think. Which, fortunately it doesn't really matter the name because it's only an incredibly important holy place in the Russian Orthodox belief. Oy. Well, Rasputin, when he went to the town that I can't pronounce, was absolutely taken with Makary. But he was not really fond of the monks that he found in the monastery there. He found them, really controlling, and he actually found them to be kind of sinful, which I'm not really sure what that means, but I don't know. Clearly they were doing something that Rasputin didn't like. As a response to meeting these monks, particularly with the issues of control, he started to do asceticism, but on his own, which I'm sure everyone he lived with was really fond of because he would not wash himself or change clothes because reeking like shit makes you closer to God or something. I don't know, but long story short, he decides, I like the kind of monk stuff, but I don't really like doing it with the other monks. So in a way, he became somewhat of a starets himself, as he traveled all over Russia and began visiting places even outside of the country, as far as Greece, which, remember, he's crossing Siberia to do that. So this man's putting some serious mileage on his feet. And when he would return home, he would tell people about his trips and about the holy places and the holy men that he'd met and seen, and about the visions of God, because that's still going on. And instead of immediately locking him up in the loony bin, people started to listen to him. He really was kind of becoming a starets in his own right. He was starting to do the asceticism stuff, not taking care of his body as a way of getting closer to God. He's going to these, places, he's meeting these people, he's having visions from God, all of that stuff. And then as he goes, he's meeting people, he's talking to them about his takes on the Bible, he's talking to them about the things that he's seen, experienced, whatever. And there are starting to be rumors that maybe he can do some miracles. Maybe he can heal some people. So, naturally, when he comes back, certain people are starting to flock to him. Though, to be fair, I imagine a number of people simply found his stories intriguing and kind of exciting because, we're in a Siberian village where the vast majority of these people are probably going to be born there and then ultimately die there and maybe not leave a whole bunch, even if at all, in their entire lives. So, it does seem, kind of possible, if not even probable, that a lot of people just kind of want to be around him because he's the most exciting man in 300 miles. But also, to be fair, some people really did seem to believe him and were into what he talked about, with his visions and all. And pretty rapidly, a small following started in Pokrovskaya, and also in the surrounding areas as well. But along with his first followers and kind of his first fans, came his first detractors. Rasputin would lead his own services, separate from the church in a little dugout beneath his father's stable. And the local churchmen and a lot of the other villagers of Pokrovskaya were not exactly excited about this, and they began to become suspicious of Rasputin. There were rumors that began to spread that he was delivering antithetical teachings and introducing foreign practices and maybe even engaging in just a smidge of heresy, as a trait. And this would be the first time that Rasputin would be accused, even if not to his face, of a sin that was so central to his identity that you can still hear that accusation today, that he was in fact a member of the Christi. Now, if you're new here and you don't know the Christi, you don't know who they are, I highly recommend that you go back a couple of episodes and listen to my earlier episode on the Christi and the Old Believers. But for those of you who aren't going to do that, or for those of you who just need a little refresher, the Christi was a splinter sect of Russian Orthodoxy. Its practices were radically, incredibly different from standard Orthodoxy. The chief differences were that they were an ascetic sect, they did not follow normal church doctrine, like not even a little, and they were incredibly secretive in their practices, and they were much, much less hierarchical than the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church saw the Chlisti as a huge threat to their authority and to their general control on religion, and did not really care for them at all, and would actually go out of their way to do absolutely everything in their power to undermine and destroy the Chlisti. One of the major things that the Orthodox Church would do was discredit the Chlisti, and they would kind of just spread rumors around and say, like, hey, these guys suck, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't be a part of them because, you don't want to suck too. And one of the major things that they would do to discredit the Chlisti is they would accuse them of being a very sexually debaucherous group. Now, there is no real proof of this, but this is an accusation that was very, very real at the time. It's something that you can even still see today when people talk about the Chlisti, particularly when talking about Rasputin. So, while there is no real proof, the Orthodox Church is kind of just in charge, and what they say goes. And the Chlisti, though in their latter days as a group kind of at this time, they're really starting to wane a little bit, really a lot of it, they were still fairly decently popular, and even a number of high-ranking Orthodox clergymen were sympathetic to the teachings of the Chlisti. Though it is likely that a lot of people in the church being accused of being members of the Chlisti were not. By their very nature, the Chlisti were unorganized and without serious hierarchy or even really doctrine. So basically, being a Chlist was kind of up to the individual, and the Orthodox Church kind of just made some shit up and said that, well, if you meet these definitions, then you're a Chlist, even if you yourself don't see yourself as one. But conversely, there were also likely plenty of people who did see themselves as members of the Chlisti, but who did not meet the church's arbitrary definitions. All this to say, it is potentially likely that Rasputin ran into Chlisti members on his travels, and maybe he did take on some of their practices or habits and rituals, but at this moment, it's really hard to tell. It's really hard to say one way or another, what was Chlisti derived, if anything, or if he himself was a believer in the teachings of the Chlisti. Because, sure, maybe he is doing kind of Chlisti things, like doing different hymns or having secret, not at normal church sermons. But there's also a perfectly logical non-Chlisti reason that he might be doing some of these things. Like, for example, he has been all over Russia, and he has been to other parts of the world. Maybe the different things that he's introducing are not necessarily Chlisti in origin, but from somewhere else. Or maybe the reason he's doing church, not at the church, is that the local church probably wouldn't be too keen on just letting old Grigori give the sermon, just this once. So, as of this point in his life, it's really hard to say if or even how much Rasputin was influenced by the Chlisti. Though, don't you worry, this question will be brought up basically constantly throughout the entirety of his life, and is a question that still hangs around today, 120 years later. Although people started to get suspicious of Rasputin, and the local church authorities did start to kind of keep a bit of an eye on him, they didn't really do anything, and Rasputin continued to travel around and have his little following at home, which did continue to grow and grow. In 1904 or 1905, no one really knows for sure, Rasputin went to the city of Kazan. Kazan is a large city in Siberia known for its cathedrals and monasteries. It's a very large city, and it is a very famous city in Russian Orthodoxy. As you might imagine, Rasputin spent all of his time visiting all these holy places, rubbing elbows with all the fancy churchmen, and generally doing all the things that he likes to do when he goes to a new fancy place. In particular, he met the Father Superior of the Seven Lakes Monastery, a man named Father Gavril. Rasputin got on incredibly well with Gavril, and one of the things that's kind of interesting is their stories are pretty similar. Both of them were peasant men who were believed to have healing powers and would ultimately go on to have a certain amount of influence in the court life in St. Petersburg. which is the really important thing here to note for Rasputin. This would be the first time that Rasputin comes near the orbit of the royals, because Gavril was an associate of the Empress's sister, a woman named Ella. While this connection to Gavril certainly isn't as close as Rasputin would come to the imperial family, and don't get me wrong, it's not like the Tsar knows who he is yet, but I like to point this out because it's just kind of crazy to show how fast Rasputin starts vaulting up the Russian social and political and ecclesiastical ladders. Remember, this is like 1904 and 1905. Rasputin started not just being some random farmer in bumfuck Siberia 7 years ago. In 7 years, Rasputin went from local dude to guy on the outskirts of the imperial family. And it's not going to take long from this point to get to close friend of the imperial family. So, I don't know, just fucking nuts to point out. But while he was in Kazan, he also met a man named Archimandrite Andrei, which an archimandrite is the head of a large monastery or the head of a number of monasteries. Basically, he is the super father superior. And much like Father Gavril, Andrei was really taken with Rasputin. And I think this kind of gives a little bit of credence to the idea that maybe he wasn't a Khlist, because a Khlisti believer and practitioner likely would have at least ruffled a few feathers among these high-class, educated churchmen. They might not have known necessarily that he was a Khlist, maybe they wouldn't have been able to kind of pinpoint exactly who he was, exactly what he was into, but if he was talking about, Khlisti ideas, then they likely would have at least kind of noticed something and be like, hey man, we're not really into what you're into. But they never really even say that. And the reason I find this particularly interesting is because the Khlisti had some pretty batshit insane ideas, at least in the eyes of the Orthodox Church. Like, for example, that the Spirit of Christ is basically resurrected within new people, and that this happens even somewhat frequently. It's actually a very central tenet to the way the Khlisti view everything. It's central to their concept of religion. So, if he brought that up, even just like a smidge, maybe these guys wouldn't know, oh, that's, some pretty serious Khlisti stuff, but that's definitely heretical. They certainly wouldn't have been happy. Now, to be fair, it could also just be that Rasputin simply understood that he was in the presence of high-power people, people whose influence and favor that he wanted access to, and just kept his mouth shut. But whatever his beliefs, he made a good impression on the local Kazan clergymen and told them of his plan to visit the imperial capital of St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was, and still is, the location of very famous churches, cathedrals, and monasteries. And at the time, it was also the home of the leadership of the Orthodox Church, and of course, the Russian imperial government. And well, if Rasputin loved anything, it was schmoozin'. But his new friends in Kazan were a little iffy on the plan. Both Archimandrite Andrei and Father Gavril had been to St. Petersburg, and both of them were familiar with the Russian imperial court and had a number of contacts with high-ranking court officials, and church officials as well, within the city. So they had a pretty decent understanding of what the scene looked like in the capital. Gavril, for his part, was not a fan. He actively told Rasputin not to go. He practically begged him. He said that the city would overpower Rasputin, and it would ultimately cause him to lose his way. He warned Rasputin of the sin and corruption of the capital, and like I said, he begged him not to go. He told him straight up, dude, you are going to get your shit rocked over there. Don't go. But Rasputin ultimately decided against Gavril's counsel and went anyways. But he did not really have the intentions of just kind of, wandering around the city, bumping into people as chance would have it. No. Instead, Archimandrite Andrei had given Rasputin some pointers on who to meet with in the city and gave Rasputin info on some of his personal contacts in the imperial court and within the clergy in St. Petersburg. So, with this information in hand, Rasputin would go to St. Petersburg. But I want to stop for a second, and let's talk a little bit about why would Rasputin go to St. Petersburg. This is a question that also has a decent amount of debate around it, but ultimately there's not really an answer. No one really knows for sure. It could have just been that it was something that he hadn't done before. He hadn't been to the imperial capital, and he just kind of wanted to do. He seemingly did really just enjoy going to holy sites and meeting new people. And this was actually something that he would do basically up until his death. He is always going to be on the move. So it could have just been that. He also did seem to really enjoy being a spiritual advisor, and boy fucking howdy, those guys in St. Petersburg were really popular. Everyone wanted a spiritual advisor at that time. So maybe he knew this, and maybe he did it for the love of the game. Maybe he really believed he was helping people, and that the imperial capital, a well-known pit of vipers, was somewhere that he could ply his trade as a holy man. As well, there is some evidence that maybe he did this to help his family. While in Kazan, Rasputin moved his daughter there in with a wealthy family that he had met. And she most definitely would be getting a much better education and would be living a much easier, likely better life in Kazan than in Pokrovskaya. So clearly, the position of his family was something that he was thinking of and seemingly wanted to do better on. And his daughter herself, Maria, points out that, she was under the impression anyways, that that's exactly why he was going to St. Petersburg. In fact, to find a school for her to go to. Or it could also be that Rasputin just wanted to schmooze his little Siberian heart out. And I'll be perfectly honest, I'm kind of more inclined to this one. And part of that is Rasputin kind of admits to that when he writes, granted years later after the fact, that he was headed to St. Petersburg to try and raise funds to help pay for a church in Pokrovskaya. So it is, to be fair, a little bit difficult to say why he did what he did. But ultimately, I think that his desire to find money and make contacts with the nobles and clergymen of St. Petersburg was likely the driving factor as to why he went there. And I think that he probably was not as interested in his church plan as maybe he kind of wanted us to believe he was. Of course, I can't tell you actually what was going through his head or, why he really ultimately did a lot of the things that he did. For one, he's been dead for over 100 years now. But also, Rasputin wasn't a dumb guy. He was aware of his status as a celebrity and also as a bit of a rogue. I find it incredibly likely that he could have made up this church story as a way to cover for his favorite activity, meeting people way above his social standing and stinking up their rooms. And that's not a joke. Rasputin was known as a particularly pungent individual. Remember, Rasputin was an ascetic, meaning he gave up physical luxuries in order to get closer to God. One of the ways he did this was by changing clothes only once a year. And yet, people still invited the giant stinky man from Siberia into their house for tea. But I have completely digressed. So, why do I think that? Why do I think that maybe Rasputin is not being 100% truthful with his church talk? Well, Pokrovskaya already had a church. And seemingly he was the only one who kind of decided that it needed a new one. So, I don't know. Something's a little fishy here. But really, at the end of the day, most of these possibilities that I've listed, most of these ones that, kind of people discuss, ultimately are ones that revolve around Rasputin's need to meet wealthy people for one reason or another. Whether it's to help his family or visit far-flung places, or to help the people of Pokrovskaya, or just to pad his own pockets, Rasputin has a need to meet wealthy benefactors, or meet people who can help him meet wealthy benefactors. But ultimately, whatever his reasons, whether they be holy or sinful, whether he's out here doing something for good, for evil, or just because he can, he does ultimately go to St. Petersburg, and he starts doing what he's done in every other city, every other town, and every other village that he's visited thus far. He starts by visiting the holy sites and getting to know the people who run them. His first stop on his whirlwind tour of the capital would be the Lavra Monastery. As Rasputin tells the story, he arrived at Lavra looking for a man named Bishop Sergei, and while looking for Sergei, a cop spotted him and ran him off because I guess that's just the kind of shit that cops do. While fleeing from the police, he ran into a doorman at the monastery and begged him to introduce him to Sergei. And ultimately, the doorman acquiesced and said, "Sure, you seem like I don't know, the kind of guy that the bishop hangs out with." Though, this is Rasputin's story. And I'll be perfectly honest, it sounds a little theatrical to me. It sounds a little churched up. It's very dramatic, you know. Here I am, a man from Siberia in the big, big city, and the man doesn't want me to be meeting with the folks in power, but then the little guy's gonna help get me in because he understands me. I don't know, man. Seems a little too fanciful. But, actually, it doesn't actually matter what I believe, because we know that's made up. We know that's a total fabrication. And how do we know? Well, because Rasputin had a letter of recommendation from his friends back in Kazan that was specifically addressed to Bishop Sergei, and it said that Rasputin was a cool dude, and that I guess the cops shouldn't, like, club him to death or whatever. And now with letter in hand, Rasputin was able to come into the Lavra Monastery and meet with Bishop Sergei. But this is actually kind of an interesting point, because now that he's in the monastery, Rasputin gets a taste of something that we haven't really seen yet in his story. Rejection. Bishop Sergei fucking hated Rasputin. He thought he was a charlatan, that he was uneducated, and likely, and I cannot stress this enough, that he smelled like shit. Which is kind of interesting that, you know, it took him this long. Remember, we started in 1897, and we are still in, like, 1905. So, it's been 7 years, and this is the first time that Rasputin's really been snubbed by someone. Of course, back in Pokrovskaya, Rasputin did have a few haters, and, you know, even the local churchmen weren't exactly, like, his biggest fans, but really, he'd done a pretty fucking fantastic job of winning over, like, every wealthy and influential person that he'd met. And even his detractors at home didn't really seem to see him as a charlatan yet. You know, they will, but not quite yet. Maybe a heretic, but not just like a charlatan, I guess. But Sergei was seemingly the only one in Lavra, and so far, like, arguably maybe one of the first, if not the first people, who really didn't like Rasputin. The other clergymen at the monastery totally fucking ate Rasputin up. Which, for Rasputin, is good, because it kind of seems that he was expecting to hit it off with Sergei, and that Sergei would vouch for him. To be fair, this is kind of like exactly what happened with seemingly every other powerful person he'd met this far. But Sergei would have been an incredibly powerful ally for Rasputin, if things, you know, had worked out. Sergei was the most famous and biggest theological mind in St. Petersburg at the time. He was incredibly connected and incredibly influential. To bag Sergei as a supporter would have rocketed Rasputin into the orbits of the wealthy and powerful almost immediately. But instead, Rasputin would be, you know, of course, snubbed. But to be fair, instead of Sergei, Rasputin got the next best thing. Rasputin met a man named Feofan. Feofan was a faculty member of the St. Petersburg Seminary and also a very popular and high-ranking member of the clergy in St. Petersburg. Although he was not as famous or as influential as Sergei, Feofan was still incredibly well known, and he had quite a number of connections in Russian high society and in the imperial court. Feofan would prove to be an indispensable friend and supporter for Rasputin in his early years. Feofan vouched often and emphatically for Rasputin to basically anyone who would listen, and though he was not the only person in St. Petersburg who liked Rasputin, he was definitely one of, if not the most connected, influential people that Rasputin would meet shortly after arriving in St. Petersburg. And it was Feofan and his connections that pretty much got Rasputin's foot in the door of St. Petersburg high society. Well, actually, not even just his foot in the door. It's kind of Feofan who thrust Rasputin right onto center stage. In the beginning, Feofan's connections were pretty make or break for Rasputin because St. Petersburg didn't really like Rasputin yet. They'll get there, but, you know, it wasn't really kind to him at first. Maria Rasputina wrote that the city did not respond well to her father, who was a little bit too kind of hick and stinky for the high-class elite of the Russian imperial capital. He had quite a bit of a hard time finding his footing and creating connections. And this is really where Feofan comes in clutch and saves the day. Feofan recommended Rasputin to a lady named Anna Abukhova, a wealthy St. Petersburg socialite who was having a bit of a crisis of faith. Apparently, Anna wanted to go be a nun, and Feofan thought that was a bad idea. I don't really know the whole story here, but I don't actually see why that's an issue, but apparently it was. And pretty much, Feofan said, "Hey Anna, I know this really cool dude from Siberia who is an amazing spiritualist and can help you through all your troubles." So, Anna said sure, and Rasputin was on the job. And as with so many others, Rasputin's charm and spiritual know-how impressed Anna, and quickly the name of the Siberian soothsayer was being spread around throughout the capital. But not only did Rasputin's fame and spiritual prowess become cemented shortly after his arrival, but so did the presence of his legendary vices. Maria Rasputina wrote that her father changed pretty quickly when he came to St. Petersburg. He was a man out of place and surrounded by the wealth, opulence, and power of the Russian capital, and he seems to have been a little influenced by it. Slowly but surely, as Rasputin became more and more popular and created stronger connections with wealthy and powerful people in the capital, he got wrapped up in the opulent culture of the city. In particular, Rasputin supposedly began drinking even more heavily. Granted, this is a mainstay of the Russian high society, and he started surrounding himself with a gaggle of incredibly wealthy and young women who were obsessed with his teachings and his supposed spiritual powers. But so far, Rasputin was seen mostly as innocuous, and he became a mainstay of the imperial court, and it was pretty common for the well-to-do of St. Petersburg to pass Rasputin around between each other, kind of like an exhibit, like, "Hey, check out this weirdo that I found." And actually, it would be this way that Rasputin would make the acquaintance of the royal family. Once again, Feofan turns out to be an instrumental person in Rasputin's story. Feofan introduced Rasputin to the Tsar's sister-in-law, and she absolutely adored Rasputin, who pretty rapidly became a central figure in her social circle. And quickly after meeting her, the princess, the Tsar's sister-in-law, introduced Rasputin to the Tsar and Tsarina. But an interesting thing to note is that no one really knows why she did this, and again, this is another fairly hotly debated issue. Some say that the princess wanted to introduce Rasputin to the Tsar and Tsarina as a way of ingratiating herself within their social circle, as a way of kind of winning their favor. While others say that this was all Feofan's plan, and that he wanted to introduce the princess to Rasputin because he understood that she would ultimately introduce Rasputin to the Tsar and Tsarina, and that his ultimate goal was to put Rasputin in their orbit as a way to counteract the foreign influences that were present at court, which is something we will talk about more next time. And then there were those that thought that the introduction of Rasputin was actually a plot concocted by the Black Hundreds, a group that is a proto-fascist, ultra-nationalist monarchist group that wanted to cement the authority of the Tsar, which is actually something that Rasputin was pretty fucking into. Rasputin was a pretty big monarchist himself, but ultimately, we really don't know. What we do know is that the Tsar's sister-in-law met with Feofan seeking spiritual guidance, and as she was an avid spiritualist and occultist, Feofan said, "Oh man, boy howdy, do I know the guy for you." So the two were introduced, and she was so taken with Rasputin that on November 1st of 1905, she introduced Rasputin to the Tsar Nikolai and the Tsarina Alexandra, which the last thing I want to stress before we close out this episode is, remember, in like 1904 or 1905, Rasputin is meeting the guys in Kazan who are on the periphery of the Tsar's power. In 1897, Rasputin is a man who awakes from a dream saying, "God has spoken to me," in a small village in Siberia where the most exciting thing that seemingly ever happened there is, I don't know, like the largest pumpkin competition of the year 1875? I don't know. This man has gone from farmer out in the middle of nowhere to literally sitting at the Tsar's table in 7 years. That's fucking nuts. But with that in mind, we're going to have to leave the rest of the story and how Rasputin gets on with the Tsar and the Tsarina for next time. For this is going to have to be the end of our episode today. So I would just like to say thank you all for joining me for this very first episode of our very first series. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you are as excited about this as I am. I am a little bit kind of like freaking out. I don't know. I think this is cool. I think Rasputin's a really interesting character, and I think you guys will really enjoy where it goes from here. As always, any and all feedback is greatly appreciated as it helps me make the show better, and of course, comments on the podcast do of course drive engagement and make the almighty algorithm happy, and well, we all want that. But that is going to have to be all for now. I hope that you're all having a wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.